Alright, I'm Skylar Earl, and I'm here to tell you a story about a personal hero that I know almost nothing about.
Woo!
My paternal great-great-grandfather.
Oh.
See, I come from what you might call a military family. My father served our country during the Vietnam War as an infantry officer in the United States Army. And in fact, his siblings also served in our Army, Navy, and Air Force. Their father, my grandfather, Luther Martin Earl, or Red, as he was known throughout his life, enlisted in the United States Army Signal Corps in 1940 to escape the drudgery of farming in rural Pennsylvania. Granddad Red spent World War II in the Pacific Theater, and he eventually received an officer's commission, rising to the rank of major after 22 years of service. The Army was his life. So when I was a kid, I asked Granddad Red if we had any other soldiers in the family. Now, he told me that his father was too old to fight in World War I, but his grandfather had fought on the Union side in the American Civil War. This legendary ancestor, of whom we apparently have no photos, was so keen to fight that he even lied about his age in order to be able to enlist. Now, young men lying about their ages to join the Army is about as old as warfare itself. Even Audie Murphy, who was the most decorated American war hero of all time, is said to have falsified documents regarding his age when he enlisted. And by the way, this is not a family photo. Can't tell. You also find this in fiction. In Robert Heinlein's Future History, the grandfather of the infamous Lazarus Long is said to have run away and lied about his age in order to join the Union Army, only to be caught by his father and brought back home. So it never occurred to me that this story about my father's 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 father could be anything other than a family myth, a private legend, a story to be swapped again and again at family reunions. But what better characterizes the young hero than a keenness to surmount any barrier keeping him from glory? While on one hand, we have regulations dating back to the American Civil War preventing boys under the age of 18 from taking up arms for the United States, our culture also goads the young man to stand between his loved home and the war's desolation. So there's a popular song that I played a little fragment of earlier it became popular during the Civil War, and it captured the promise of the honor and the adulation that awaited any young man who would dare to be a war hero. And the lyrics go, when Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah. I'm not singing this because I like you and I'm concerned for your welfare. When Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah. We'll give him a hearty welcome then, hurrah. The men will cheer and the boys will shout, and the ladies, they will all turn out, and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. Now, the word gay has changed meanings in the 20th century, and so when people sing this now, they say, we'll all feel glad when Johnny comes marching home. But regardless of sort of what your preference is, the point here is Johnny, the ladies, they'll all come out when you come marching home again. And this is the idea, right? Is that there's a promise that's being made to the would-be hero of all of the glory that awaits him after the war, right? So other than being in a minor key, this song makes no mention of warfare itself. It's all about when Johnny comes marching home. Now, my curiosity about my own mythical ancestor was reborn after watching Ken Burns' epic 11-hour documentary on the American Civil War, which I wholeheartedly recommend. And I followed that up by reading Shelby Foote's even more monumental 3-volume, 3,000-page history, The Civil War, a narrative, which is not only a definitive history of the war, but I think a worthy candidate possibly for the best history of anything ever, except for the fact that it was written by a white guy, so take that with a grain of salt. Although if you have seen Ken Burns, then you're well acquainted with the most mellifluous southern accent proffered by the eminent Mr. Shelby Foote. He's a scholar of excellent repute. I could listen to that guy all day. So now we live in an era where the internet can basically instantaneously gratify any idle curiosity literally to a fault. And so before too long, I found my great-great-grandfather in a genealogical database, starting with his birth record from Old Zion Church in Sullivan County, Pennsylvania, in German, mind you, a son of Pastor Karl L. Erle and his wife, born the 21st of November, 1847, and baptized the 13th of January, receiving the name Augustus Martin Luther. Here, I think, are his parents, much later in their lives. This is Karl Ludwig Erle, who was a Lutheran preacher, and his wife, Hetty Hunsinger Erle, or Early or Earl, depending on who you talk to. At least this is what the internet claims. These were, Karl Ludwig was from Hanover, from Germany. He didn't speak much English. So here we have a record of Augustus Martin Luther in the 1850 census. Now he is simply Martin Luther Earl, or Early, or Erlo. He's living at home with his parents and his two siblings. And he's age 2 in the 1850 census. But the database that I found has this cryptic reference. It says, served in Civil War, Company B, 58th Pennsylvania. Well, I'm in luck, right? Because the muster rolls of the Union Army are extremely well documented, and so all I have to do is find Company B of the 58th Pennsylvania Infantry, and wouldn't you know there isn't an Earl anywhere in the rolls. In fact, the Civil War veteran search provided by the National Park Service lists only 3 Earls serving the Union from Pennsylvania, and not one of them is named Martin or Luther or has served in the 58th Pennsylvania. So I'm like, what's going on here? I'm confused. But then I find something even more odd. It's a reference to my grandfather, Luther Earl, in the October 10th, 1890 edition of, this is the Tuckahannock Republican, which was published weekly in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And he is listed as attending a reunion of veterans from the 58th Pennsylvania, right there under Company B, except that this was 30 years before my grandfather was born, which means it has to be his grandfather, Martin Luther, or just Luther Earl. So there's, what's going on here, right? So finally I stumble across the 1890 Special Veteran Census, because by 1890, the federal government had been hounded for over a quarter century by veterans, their dependents, and widows, all looking to collect pensions for the heroes' wartime service. These rolls are regarded as incomplete, inaccurate, and at some point in the 20th century, all of the veterans' rolls, the Special Veteran Census from 1890 for the states alphabetically from Alabama to Kansas were accidentally burned.
Oh, jeez.
But Pennsylvania was still intact, and I discovered this because here he is, Luther Earl, alias John Eberly, who applied for a veteran's pension in 1887. Wait, alias? Alias? Wait, are you trying to tell me my great-great-grandfather had a nom de guerre? This is amazing. And then I go back to the rolls of the 58th Pennsylvania, and there he is, John Eberly, or sometimes Eberly, private, Company B, enlisted March 30th, 1864, and mustered on the very same day, age 18. Wait, 18? Now, I'm no mathematician, but if he was born in the winter of 1847, then by the spring of 1864, he was 16 years old. Well, the pieces all fit, don't they? My father's 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 father really did run away from home to enlist in the Union Army, and I have the documentation to prove it. He probably did so in response to a newspaper ad like this one. He lied about his age so that they'd take him, and then he lied about his name so no one would catch him doing it. Now, he rather unimaginatively, it turns out the name Eberly was a second cousin who lived down the street, so somewhat unimaginative. But just like that, at the tender age of 16, Martin Luther Earl became Private John Eberly, or sometimes Eberlin, of Company B, 58th Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment on United States service. Now, my grandfather never met his grandfather. Thanks. So the story of Private Eberly's war service is frankly conjecture. What we know is that he was part of a detachment of the 58th Pennsylvania that was sent to Fortress Monroe in Virginia at the end of April. And at the beginning of June, they were sent by transport up the James River. Thank you. Where they disembarked and marched directly to the front lines of a place called Cold Harbor. Yeah, Cold Harbor. My ancestor marched out of the recruiting office and right into the most lopsided Union defeat of the entire war. Years later, no less than Ulysses Grant would write, "I have always regretted that the last assault at Cold Harbor was ever made. No advantage whatever was gained to compensate for the heavy loss we sustained." The Union veterans also knew what they were up against because at dawn on June 3rd, they would be asked to assault a very heavily entrenched portion of the Confederate battle line. This was going to be Fredericksburg all over again. An aide to General Grant later wrote that I noticed that many of these soldiers had taken off their coats and seemed to be engaged in sewing up rents in them before the battle. And this was strange, except that when he looked closer, he found that the men were calmly writing their names and home addresses on slips of paper and pinning them to their backs so that people back home would know what had become of them. So what did Private Eberly make of all this? Well, we can sort of guess because the New York Daily Herald reported on June 7th about the charge of the 58th Pennsylvania. It says, under the command of Captain Cecil Clay, they charged the works and succeeded in carrying the enemy's rifle pits. Here, however, they found themselves close prisoners as it was utterly impossible for a head or arm to make its appearance without being riddled by bullets. For 2 long hours, the regiment held this position until they were reinforced. Wow. So eventually a retreat was called, leading to what one Southern officer referred to as, quote, perhaps the easiest victory ever granted to Confederate arms by the folly of Federal commanders. It wasn't Fredericksburg all over again, it was worse. More Union soldiers would die at Cold Harbor than were killed on the field of Fredericksburg, Antietam, 1st or 2nd Bull Run, and a handful of other better-known fights. But the 58th Pennsylvania wasn't done yet, and neither was Private Eberly. On the 29th of September, he had probably his closest brush with what is popularly known as heroism, while assaulting Fort Harrison near Petersburg, Virginia, where his company commander was killed, along with 130 others of his regiment, and 2 of his fellow soldiers won the Medal of Honor. One was the regimental commander, now Colonel Clay, and the other was a boy from Johnny's very own Company B. But the war had taken its toll on the 58th. The Philadelphia Inquirer reported in October, quote, there is little left of the old banner save some shreds. And afterwards, the 58th was never engaged in anything more strenuous than garrison duty. Hundreds out of a regiment of a couple thousand men had been killed or wounded, and hundreds more died of disease. But among those not dead was Private Eberly, and we know this for 2 reasons. One, I'm telling you this story. And second, his service record says that he remained with the 58th Pennsylvania right up until they were mustered out in January 1866. Now, by this point, it was widely accepted that the North had been engaged in a war to resuscitate the Union and end the evil of slavery. But what do we think Johnny Eberly thought of war and of glory and of heroism after what he had seen? When Johnny comes marching home again. Well, there's another version of this song that became popular just a couple years later and has lyrics like, where are the legs with which you run when first you went to carry a gun? Indeed, your dancing days are done. Oh, Johnny, I hardly knew you. So, when Johnny Eberly came marching home again, he was 18 years old, and he had probably had enough of heroism for several lifetimes. He shed the mantle of Private Eberly along with his blue wool uniform and became simply Luther Earl. The following year, he married Susanna, or Susan Hunsinger, who happened to be his second cousin. Because, look, I'm not here to judge my ancestors, okay? This was rural Pennsylvania in the mid-19th century. They had probably known each other their entire lives. That's just what they did. And they wasted no time in getting on with it, because in the 1870 census, we see Luther and Susan back in Old Sullivan County, right next door to his parents with 2 kids of their own. Yeah. He became a farmer, and they actually wound up having 7 children in all. In 1887, at the age of 40, Luther applied to the government for a veteran's pension, citing weak eyes as his disability. And he continued to attend veterans get-togethers. This year is a photo of the 40th anniversary reunion of the boys of the 58th Pennsylvania, but it does not include Luther Earl because he had died 3 years earlier. So in 1847, as an infant, he was baptized Augustus Martin Luther, and in 1850, as a boy, he was known as Martin. In 1864, for a year and 10 months, a brief bloody time, he became Private John Eberly, or Eberlin, of the 58th Pennsylvania Infantry. But when he went home a man, he was Luther, and he never used any other name again. It appears in every subsequent document I could find, and it's engraved on his headstone. And that is almost all I know about. Right? What does this mean, this final name change from Augustus to Martin to Private Eberly to Luther? It's the only definitive evidence I have that the war changed him in any way. So Luther's son Nelson named his own eldest son, my grandfather, Luther Martin, for his father, the war hero. But what is a hero anyway? I mean, in the end, there's nothing special about my ancestor. I don't even have any photos of him. He was just some guy. I mean, arguably he was duped by society into running away to join the army. He evidently did whatever it was that was expected of him there, and then he lived, maybe barely, to tell the tale. So I would like to offer a toast to my great-great-grandfather Luther, alias Private John Eberly, or Eberlin, who was just some guy. And in his name, to all the young people who ever did, perhaps foolishly, but in the manner of heroes, the thing that needed doing, simply and quietly, and then they marched the hell back home. Yeah.